The Chinese Commerce Ministry stated and has confirmed that Vice Premier He Lifeng will attend trade talks with the United States in Stockholm from July 27th to 30th, alongside U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. China has expressed regret over the United States' decision to withdraw from UNESCO, calling it not the behavior of a responsible major country. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Guo Jiakun also stressed Beijing's continued support for the UN Cultural and Educational Agency. A Russian delegation led by Vladimir Medinsky is now en route to Turkey for the first peace talks with Ukraine in over 7 weeks, according to Russian news agencies. The talks set to take place today followed 2 rounds in May and June that resulted in the exchange of thousands of prisoners without a breakthrough. Meanwhile, Russia has slammed Italy for cancelling a July 27th concert by pro-Putin conductor Valery Gergiev, calling the move discriminatory and influenced by Ukrainian lobbying. The event planned at the Regia di Caserta near Naples was dropped following public outcry from Italian politicians and activists, including the widow of Alexei Navalny. Over 100 aid and rights organizations have issued an urgent call for action as hunger deepens in Gaza, demanding an immediate permanent ceasefire and the removal of all aid restrictions. The groups say starvation is spreading while truckloads of life-saving supplies remain blocked outside the Strip. U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff will travel to Rome this week to push for a ceasefire in Gaza. Amid mounting humanitarian suffering, he is expected to meet Israel's Ron Dermer and a senior Qatari official on Thursday, according to Axios. Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba has dismissed reports that he plans to resign, calling the claims completely unfounded. A source close to Ishiba says he's staying in office at least until a trade deal with the US is finalized by the August 1st deadline. After a 5-year freeze, India will resume issuing tourist visas to Chinese nationals from July 24th. The move marks a significant step towards repairing ties damaged by the 2020 border clash and subsequent trade restrictions. Ukrainian and Russian delegations are heading to Turkey for a fresh round of peace negotiations, scheduled for today evening in Istanbul. A senior Ukrainian official has confirmed that the Ukrainian delegation is en route. Meanwhile, Russian state media has reported that the Russian delegation has also departed Moscow to participate in what will be the 3rd round of talks between the two sides. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov confirmed Russia's participation and stated that Russia expected the meeting to be very difficult. He noted that discussions would include issues related to draft memorandums and potential exchanges. Now we're joined by Professor Veselin Popovsky. He's a professor and vice dean at Jindal Global Law School, joining us live from Bulgaria. Thank you, Professor, for joining us today. Good to see you. Now, the Kremlin has mentioned issues relating to draft memorandums. What kind of agreements of compromises could realistically emerge from this discussion that is to take part today?
Well, we still need to see what will happen. This is the 3rd round of negotiation between Russia and Ukraine. The first 2 rounds, also in Istanbul, produced very little, as we remember. There was basically exchange of prisoners of war, 1,000 each, which is a good news for the families, but not much more than that in terms of the ceasefire of peace negotiations. And the 2nd round also exchanged some dead bodies. Again, very minimal outcome out of those 2 rounds. So this one, the indication is there could be a further prisoners of war exchanges. Again, I will consider this to be very minimal. Obviously, families will enjoy some boys coming back home, but in terms of the war, in terms of the ceasefire, that's nothing yet. We haven't seen anything. The positions of Russia are demanding territories, demanding demilitarization of Ukraine, and all of these are absolutely unacceptable. So unless Russia is under pressure to remove those demands, there is a very little hope that something will come out of the Istanbul meeting. There are also talks about high-level meeting between the two presidents, Putin and Zelensky. Again, we need to see how serious are those. Usually, yes, maybe such a meeting can give a certain dynamics and produce something, but that's not yet clear whether such a meeting will happen and what will the outcome be. So I remain very skeptical about the negotiations from today in Istanbul, unless we see some new dynamics, unless we see some developments. Otherwise, if it is just another meeting for the sake of another meeting, that doesn't produce much. Russians are trying to play that game, to show they are constructive on the negotiation table, but in the meantime, they continue to bomb and kill civilians in Ukraine. They continue the war fight. They don't agree on a ceasefire, something which was often discussed already many times. There were demands by the US administration and Donald Trump personally to agree on an unconditional 30 days ceasefire, and the Russians simply ignored all of those already for 6 months, which means, again, not much to expect from Istanbul meeting between Ukraine and Russia.
And Professor, now given the Kremlin statement that no one expects an easy journey, what are the main challenges that are likely to hinder progress in the upcoming talks?
Well, the position remains very different, as I mentioned. The Russians are demanding unrealistically basically Russia is telling Ukraine to surrender, which obviously cannot happen because Ukraine is defending very successfully its territory. Russia is not doing any military advances, and they're trying through diplomatic channels to achieve what they cannot achieve through military means. And that's not a proper game. So effectively, Russia is confirming that its own position is absolutely unrealistic. You cannot demand the opposite side to surrender if you have no tools to do this politically or with military force. Obviously, the world is very much behind Ukraine already. Even the US administration realized that the Russian side is the one with no cooperation at all. And over time, the expectation would be to increase the sanctions on Russia and to increase the support for Ukraine. And that's what all states should do in order to see some outcome here. Unless Russia is punished for what it did over the last 3.5 years, and not only with sanctions, but also with much stronger pressures, very little can be achieved. Russia remain ignorant exactly because they don't feel the punishment of all the war crimes, all the killing of civilians, which they did over the last 3.5 years.
And Professor, lastly, why is Turkey's role as a host for these negotiations? Like, what is their role?
Yeah, Turkey is, first of all, very geographically well situated to host Ukrainians and Russians. It's very short flight from Kiev and Moscow to go to Istanbul. It's also kind of a strong global player over time. President Erdogan is ambitious to show that Turkey can be a peace negotiator. There were negotiations in Istanbul in the beginning of the conflict back 3.5 years ago. Turkey wants to be seen as a kind of a emerging global power. with its diplomatic experiences. It used to be Ottoman Empire back in the 19th century. So it's actually a very good place to meet, both historically, geographically, politically. President Erdogan has a good respect both in Ukraine and Russia. So all admiration for Turkey to do that work. Absolutely no problem with that.
Thank you for that insight. Please stay with us as we stay on this topic. That was Professor Popovsky. Now we move on to our next news. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has vowed to deliver a joint anti-corruption plan within 2 weeks, following mounting public outrage. Speaking after a meeting with anti-graft and security officials, Zelensky said the government had heard the voice of the people, a reference to the nationwide protests against moves seen as undermining the independence of anti-corruption bodies. The protests have put pressure on the government to reassert its commitment to clean governance, especially as Kyiv continues to seek EU membership and Western support amid its war with Russia. Now we go back to our guest discussion with Professor Vasilin Popovsky. Professor, thank you for staying with us. Now, how critical is President Zelensky's promise of a joint anti-corruption plan within only the next two weeks?
I think that's a good move. President Zelensky is listening to the people's voices. It's a democracy. Ukraine is not Russia. In Ukraine, we have fair elections, we have a balance of powers, we have a parliament and judiciary that are very independent. People's voice is very also important here. Yes, Ukraine used to be part of the Soviet Union, and from those days, it inherited some kind of corruption practices, but over time, it became a very much a candidate for the European Union membership already, meant a lot for Ukraine. It wants to move on with further anti-corruption measures, with further anti-criminal measures, with further independence of the judiciary and all that. And for that matter, I'm also very hopeful that the corruption in Ukraine will be reduced to a minimum over time. There were changes in government, there were changes in some of the organs of the administrations. So yes, a democracy like Ukraine is listening to the voice of the people, lead over time into the right direction. So I see absolutely no problem. Yes, there are protests. These are normal, as I say. In every democratic country, there should be protests. If people are not happy, they should be allowed to speak. They should not fear to speak, which is the case in dictatorships. Like you cannot see protests in Russia because every protester will end in jail. Ukraine is a democratic country. Everybody can express their freedom of expression, freedom of speech. So absolutely no problem with that. Over time, I think the corruption in Ukraine will be properly combated and reduced to a minimum.
And Professor, so now how might the ongoing war with Russia impact Ukraine's ability to implement and enforce anti-corruption reforms effectively?
Yes, that's definitely a concern. Ukraine is in a war, and its priorities mostly are to defend its territories and to liberate the occupied territories. And for that matter, any other domestic politics could be jeopardized for some time because of that shift in priority towards overall security issues. But again, as I said, the proper direction is there. They listen to people's voices. They want to improve. They want to reduce corruption. So I'm fully hopeful that the Ukrainian government and its administration will do the best to implement the law, to acknowledge human rights, and to defend human rights. So yes, it will be difficult, but the direction is the correct one, and Ukraine is moving there.
Thank you for sharing that insight. Please stay with us as we stay on this topic. Now, Russia's Ministry of Defense has claimed control of a settlement in Donetsk on Tuesday, while Ukrainian forces reported 176 clashes along the front lines. Russia also destroyed several Ukrainian military sites, including electronic warfare stations and ammunition depots, using advanced weapons such as the Kinzhal hypersonic missile. In response, Ukraine's military targeted Russian personnel and equipment, particularly in the Slobozansky and Kursk regions. Both sides reported significant drone activity, with Ukraine downing 256 Russian drones and 18 missiles, while Russia destroyed 259 Ukrainian drones. Diplomatically, Ukraine and Russia are set to meet in Istanbul for peace talks today, on Thursday, led by Ukrainian National Security and Defense Council Secretary Rustom Umerov. The focus will be on prisoner exchanges and the return of deported Ukrainian children. Meanwhile, Russia reported seizing Warachin in Ukraine's Sumy region, further expanding its territorial control. Russia's military rearmament continues, with plans to spend $1.1 trillion by 2036 in preparation for potential NATO conflict. Now we go back to our guest discussion with Professor Veselin Popovsky. He's a professor and vice dean at Jindal Global Law School. Thank you, Professor, for staying with us. Now, what are the implications of Russia's $1.1 trillion military rearmament plan through 2036, especially concerning potential future conflicts with NATO?
Again, we need to double check the numbers here and whether this is simply a promise to gather some domestic support for the otherwise criminal action done by Kremlin and Vladimir Putin. I simply will ask, where will Russia get that money from if its economy is collapsing over time? And it will be even worse because of the continuous losses by Russian army in Ukraine. It lost already 1 million soldiers, over 1 million, dead and injured. I heard yesterday they are trying to import Indian working people, 1 million of working people, but that's again for me not proven, not confirmed and verified. So the Russian economy is in shambles, and I don't expect much in terms of possible mobilization of human resources, possible mobilization of financial resources or any other resources. So yes, any statement by the Russian authorities I will take with some kind of a doubt whether that's possible or not, or whether it's just yet another propaganda tool to make things look good. And that's what usually in dictatorship, it's always like this, you know. Everybody around Vladimir Putin will try to tell him that everything is fine, everything is going under the plan, we are doing well, we can mobilize this and that. But that's what he wants to hear from the people around him. There is no criticism, there is no protest, as I mentioned earlier. Ukraine is a very different story. It's an open society, it's democratic. President Zelensky can listen to criticism and improve if he makes a mistake. President Putin cannot listen and cannot improve if he makes mistakes, and he does make a lot of mistakes. So that's the difference here, and I'm not sure that Russia will produce that amount of munitions and weapons and more military force. They are really exhausting the last possible options there. And the fact that Russia had to buy soldiers from North Korea, 25,000, is already signaling why does Russia need North Koreans to fight? Because they don't have Russians anymore. That's the answer. Nobody in Russia wants to fight that war. And they have to go to North Korea to bring soldiers from over there. So that's the reality here. And again, I would not possibly trust the information coming from such sources in Moscow.
Thank you very much, Professor Veselin Popovsky, for joining us today and sharing your insight throughout our news. Now we move on to our next news. Senior U.S. and Israeli as well as Syrian officials are expected to meet on July 24th in an effort to reach security understandings regarding the situation in southern Syria, according to reports. This will be the first meeting between the parties since the crisis erupted last week in the city of Sueda in southern Syria last week. Reports suggest that the meeting will be chaired by U.S. Syria envoy Tom Barak, who has been mediating between the parties in recent weeks. The meeting is expected to focus on security arrangements in southern Syria and on increasing coordination and communication between Israel and Syria to prevent crisis between these countries. Now we are joined by Ross Feingold. He's a political analyst joining us live from Taipei. Thank you, Ross, for joining us today. Good to see you. Now, this meeting represents the first high-level dialogue between U.S., Israel, and Syrian officials. Now, how significant is this development in terms of regional diplomacy?
Certainly, it's significant that they're talking. I mean, historically, interaction between Syria and Israel, or their governments, was basically non-existent. So if they actually are going to be in the same room, if that's what the plan is, and it's not to be indirect discussions, then that is really unusual, because it's really happened rarely or almost never over the past 70 plus years. But the important thing here is not simply that they're talking, but that they're looking for a way to reach an end to the violence that has struck this region of Syria over the past few weeks.
And now, do you think that mediation, how effective is the mediation role of U.S. between them and Tom Barak that will be facilitating this dialogue, particularly considering the historical mistrust between the two parties that are involved?
Certainly the Syrians are highly incentivized to be accommodating in these talks. They want support from the United States. They want the United States to continue to say favorable things about the new government, which the United States and Tom Barak have been doing, actually. And of course, there was the meeting between President Trump and the new Syrian president earlier this year. So Syria wants more positive signals to come out from the U.S. government towards their new government and potentially other types of assistance. Generally, Israel will also try to please the United States. It's unusual for Israel to ignore or to buck the United States. However, we have seen even in recent weeks, there have been several examples or several situations, including in Syria, where the Netanyahu government has been willing to take action, notwithstanding the objections of the United States. But generally, both sides here, both Syria as well as Israel, they're not looking to be the difficult party in the room. They both want to please the United States.
And Ross, now what impact could successful security arrangement and increased communication between these two neighbors have on the broader Middle Eastern geopolitical landscape?
It's unclear what it would mean more broadly. Again, the most immediate goal here is to have a ceasefire and to end the violence that has occurred in this part of Syria over the recent few weeks. There are other areas of Syria where Israel is not involved, but the new government is still in a state of hostilities with armed groups on the ground. It remains to be seen whether the United States is going to get involved in those situations as well. Of course, there's the very large Kurdish armed groups in northeastern Syria, which have had a close relationship with the United States, and they haven't integrated into the new military yet, and they're retaining their autonomy. So that's very much an open issue. But is the possibility of some kind of agreement between Israel and Syria with regard to the Sueda region and protecting the Druze minority? Is that going to have an effect on other parts of Syria or other parts of the Middle East? I would say no. I think this negotiation really is about a specific area and specific armed groups in Syria.
Ross, thank you for sharing that insight. Please stay with us as we stay on this topic. Now, Israeli Foreign Minister Gideon Sa'ar visited Kyiv on July 22nd for talks with Ukrainian officials on regional security and defense cooperation. The two nations agreed to launch a dedicated dialogue on the Iranian threat, which both ministers described as a shared existential danger. Ukrainian Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha emphasized that Iran's nuclear ambitions and support for terrorism alongside Russian actions threaten global security. Sa'ar stressed Israel's commitment to Ukraine, citing humanitarian aid, medical support, and defense cooperation, including mobile water purification systems for eastern Ukraine. Here's what the two ministers had to say.
На тлі цих загроз домовилися активізувати багатосторонню і двосторонню співпрацю. І сьогодні ми вирішили започаткувати окремий діалог щодо іранської загрози. Ми про це домовилися з міністром. Я висловив вдячність Ізраїлю за гуманітарну допомогу, зокрема проект у сфері водопостачання південних регіонів України.
We condemn Russia's strikes against civilians. We call for a durable and lasting peace which ensures security for Ukraine. We decided today to have a strategic dialogue between our ministries on the Iranian threat. Our actions against its weapons and technology contribute to European security and to the security of Ukraine. Iran must not be allowed to continue its nuclear ambitions.
The ministers also discussed efforts to counter Iran's nuclear program, with Sa'ar urging the international community to act decisively against Tehran. He thanked Ukraine for its support in opposing Iran's nuclear weapons ambitions and for imposing sanctions on Iranian individuals. Now we go back to our guest discussion with Ross Feingold. Thank you, Ross, for staying with us. Now, can you tell us why this timing, and why is it Ukraine and Israel giving this joint declaration on Iran as threat?
Certainly, Israel and Ukraine have a shared interest in stopping Iran's proliferation of weapons. It's clear that Iran has provided assistance to Russia throughout the period after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and specifically with regard to drones. Obviously, Iran has proliferated weapons to Israel's enemies, such as Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in the Gaza Strip, as well as previously to armed groups in Syria before the change in government in Syria. And of course, there's the unresolved Iran nuclear threat, since at the moment we're still unsure just how much of a setback Iran's nuclear weapons program experienced after the recent war. So Israel and Ukraine certainly do have a shared interest in stopping some of Iran's nefarious behavior, which does cause, as the minister said, an existential threat for both countries. One of the interesting things here, though, is throughout the period after Russia invaded Ukraine, there was some criticism of Israel, that Israel was taking a bit of a standoffish approach to Ukraine when, at the time, the Biden administration and certainly European countries were all very vociferous in both words as well as action in support of Ukraine, providing weapons and other types of assistance. And Israel previously, Prime Minister Netanyahu had a fairly good relationship with President Putin. And for a long time, Israel was kind of reluctant to be seen as taking sides in the dispute. In fact, when the war began, there was even talk of Israel playing a mediator role between Ukraine and Russia, although that never actually occurred. But I think with some of the frustration that President Trump has expressed with President Putin and President Putin's continued attacks on Ukraine, even in this period when President Trump has repeatedly called on Putin to participate and participate in ceasefire talks and reach a ceasefire agreement. So we could be in a new environment where Israel feels